unit is Berdan's United States Sharpshooters, and the army that tried and failed to neutralize them was the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. August 30th, 1862. The Second Battle of Bull Run, Virginia. Companies of Berdan's sharpshooters pushed forward across an open field toward an unfinished railroad cut, where Stonewall Jackson's men lay concealed among the grading and the scattered timber, sent ahead of the main Union assault to soften the Confederate position before the infantry arrived behind them. The sharpshooters drove back the Confederate skirmish line easily enough at first, advancing with the confidence of men who had spent more than a year proving that accurate rifle fire could do what massed infantry could not. But Jackson's men had no intention of simply falling back the way earlier opponents had. They opened fire from the cover of the railroad grade in overwhelming volume, a wall of musketry that no amount of individual marksmanship could answer shot for shot, and the sharpshooters found themselves pinned flat in a dry creek bed with no way forward and no clean way back, taking casualties from a fixed position they could not maneuver around, no matter how skilled any single man among them was with a rifle. It should have been the moment the Confederate High Command finally solved the problem these green-coated riflemen had been causing them for a full year. Pin them down, overwhelm them with volume, and let the numbers do what precision alone never could. It was not that moment. The sharpshooters held their ground under fire, kept shooting whenever a target presented itself, and eventually fell back in order rather than in rout, carrying their wounded with them across ground that offered almost no cover for the retreat, living to serve through 2 more years of a war that would end with the Confederacy defeated and Berdan's men still very much intact. So what was it about this particular regiment that no Confederate tactic, no counter-sniper, and no amount of concentrated fire ever quite managed to put down for good? The problem started, from the Confederate point of view, in the summer of 1861, when a New York inventor and champion marksman named Hiram Berdan convinced the War Department to let him build something the American Army had never fielded before. Berdan was in his mid-30s at the time, already wealthy from a string of patents, and already recognized in formal national competition as the finest rifle shot in the country. Rather than raise another regiment of ordinary infantry, he proposed recruiting the single best rifle shots from across the northern states and organizing them into a unit that would fight as individuals, using cover, patience, and precision rather than the massed volleys every other regiment on either side relied on. The standard for entry was brutal. A recruit had to place 10 consecutive shots inside a circle, roughly 10 inches across from 200 yards away, using a rifle in firing position of his own choosing, a test that eliminated the overwhelming majority of men who tried it at the regional trials Berdan's recruiters organized across New England, New York, and the upper Midwest. The ones who passed were hunters, farmers, and backwoodsmen who had spent their whole lives reading wind and judging distance, not soldiers accustomed to standing shoulder to shoulder in a firing line waiting for an order to volley. By the end of that year, 18 companies drawn from 8 different states had qualified, enough to form 2 full regiments, and the men who wore Berdan's dark green coats and carried Sharp's breech-loading rifles would spend the next 4 years proving that a rifle in patient, skilled hands was a fundamentally different kind of weapon from a musket in a crowd. Confederate officers understood almost immediately that ordinary tactics were not going to solve this problem. At the siege of Yorktown in the spring of 1862, Berdan's men established a pattern that would repeat itself across the entire war. They did not charge Confederate positions, and they did not stand in the open trading volleys the way a normal skirmish line would. They crawled forward into no man's land in 2s and 3s, found whatever cover the ground offered, and waited for hours at a stretch for a single clean shot at an officer, a gunner, or a careless sentry who forgot for even a moment to keep his head below the earthworks. There was no reliable countermeasure to this kind of warfare in 1862, because nothing in European or American military doctrine up to that point had trained officers to fight an enemy who refused to present a target worth volleying at. Massing troops to charge a handful of hidden riflemen wasted men for no gain, since the sharpshooters would simply melt back into the woods before any assault reached them, leaving the attacking force to storm empty ground, Returning fire blindly into the tree line accomplished little against a man lying flat behind natural cover who had already picked his next shot before firing his first. Confederate soldiers adapted the only way they reasonably could by staying low, moving quickly across open stretches, and hoping the sharpshooters happened to be watching someone else at that particular moment. It was not a solution so much as a habit born of necessity, and it did not work nearly often enough to matter to the men who had to live with it every day on the line. By the time of Malvern Hill that July, the final clash of the 7 days' battles, fought as the Union Army withdrew down the Virginia Peninsula, the sharpshooters had turned this problem from an annoyance into something closer to a tactical weapon in its own right. A Confederate artillery crew from the 1st Richmond Howitzers wheeled a gun into position on rising ground, ready to add its fire to the massed assault building against the Union line below, and within about 10 minutes, Berdan's men had killed or wounded enough of the crew, working through the loader, the gunner, and the man holding the lanyard in careful sequence, that the piece never fired a single round in the entire engagement. Confederate batteries began treating any tree line within rifle range as a hazard equal to enemy artillery itself, since a battery that lost its trained crew became useless iron, regardless of how many shells remained stacked in its limber. There was no way to armor against this threat the way a soldier could shelter behind a breastwork from cannon fire, because the danger was not explosive shrapnel, but a single well-aimed bullet from a man who might be 400 yards away and completely invisible. The only real defense was staying out of range entirely, and on a battlefield as contested and as heavily wooded as Virginia's, staying out of range was rarely an option. Confederate gun crews were actually given by the tactical situation they found themselves in. Individual feats of shooting kept adding to the reputation through the middle years of the war, and not every one of them came in the chaos of a major battle. At Kelly's Ford in Virginia, in November of 1863, during a smaller engagement as Confederate troops pulled back from the position under Union pressure, 2 sharpshooters named Corporal Abner Johnson and George Fisher both noticed a lone Confederate straggler retreating across open ground at what witnesses estimated as roughly 700 yards, a range most infantry regiments of the era considered far beyond reliable rifle fire and not worth the ammunition to attempt. Onlookers urged Johnson to try the shot, and he raised his Sharps rifle, adjusted his sights for the distance, allowed for the wind, and said simply that he would try him. Fisher, urged on by the same men watching from cover, aimed and fired at almost the same instant Johnson did. The Confederate soldier went down immediately, and when Union troops advanced to the spot, they found he had been hit twice, once through each leg, at a distance most soldiers on either side would not have even attempted to engage a man they could barely make out. Stories like this one spread through both armies quickly, carried by soldiers who had watched it happen or heard it retold within days, and each one reinforced the same lesson for Confederate troops serving anywhere near the Army of the Potomac. Distance that would have meant complete safety against an ordinary infantry regiment meant essentially nothing at all against Berdan's men, and there was no way to know in advance which stretch of empty field might have a rifle trained on it from 400 or 500 yards away. Part of what made the sharpshooters so difficult to counter was a level of discipline that had no real equivalent anywhere else in either army. Ordinary skirmishers were trained to fire, fall back, and rejoin the main line when pressed. Berdan's men were trained to do the opposite, to stay in place under fire, sometimes for an entire day, waiting for one target worth the shot, rather than firing repeatedly at anything that moved. Some climbed trees to gain a clear line of sight over broken ground, accepting the added risk of being spotted in exchange for a wider field of view across enemy positions. Others worked in pairs, one man watching through a glass for movement, while the other kept his rifle ready, splitting the mental burden of a task that demanded total concentration for hours at a stretch. This was not how either army trained its regular infantry, and it meant that standard Confederate battlefield doctrine, built around volleys, charges, and defensible lines, simply did not have a built-in answer for an enemy that refused to behave like conventional infantry at all. A regimental commander could plan for an assault. He could plan for artillery. Planning for a handful of invisible men willing to wait in the mud for 6 hours to take a single shot required a completely different kind of vigilance that most Confederate units never fully developed, no matter how many warnings passed down the chain of command about staying low near a tree line. Confederate commanders eventually tried to build a real countermeasure rather than rely on luck and low profiles. Some units imported British Whitworth rifles, expensive single-shot weapons with a distinctive hexagonal bore, prized for accuracy at ranges well beyond what a standard infantry musket could manage, and fielded their own small groups of trained marksmen to hunt Union officers and artillery crews in turn. These Confederate riflemen achieved real moments of individual fame elsewhere in the war, most notably against Union officers on other fronts, proving that the basic concept Berdan had pioneered could be copied by anyone willing to invest in the training and the equipment. Later in the war, the Confederate Congress went further still, authorizing brigade commanders across the entire Army of Northern Virginia to pull their best shots out of regular infantry regiments and organize them into makeshift sharpshooter battalions of their own, a direct and formal response to a problem that had been growing for 2 full years by that point. The effort came slowly and unevenly in practice, since regimental commanders were reluctant to give up their most reliable riflemen to a separate command structure, and it never matched the scale, the standardized training, or the organizational depth Berdan had built from the very first summer of the war, with dedicated recruiting trials and a formal chain of command running through his own colonelcy. Whitworth marksmen and the scattered Confederate sharpshooter battalions that eventually formed were a genuine improvement over having no answer at all, but nothing the Confederacy fielded over 4 years of trying ever forced Berdan's regiments off a battlefield entirely, broke their formations in a way that ended their usefulness, or stopped them from operating the way they always had from Yorktown onward. The imitation itself told its own story about how the war had changed. An army does not scramble for 2 years to copy a tactic it considers already beaten. Even the Confederacy's best organized attempts at retaliation tended to produce isolated losses for Berdan's men rather than any lasting solution to the larger problem. At Antietam that September, in the ferocious fighting around the cornfield, ground that changed hands repeatedly through the morning until the corn itself was cut to stubble by the sheer weight of rifle fire, the 2nd Regiment took genuinely severe casualties. More than a dozen officers were killed or wounded, and dozens of enlisted men were killed, wounded, or missing in a single morning's fighting, including the regiment's own adjutant, who had only taken command in the field after his colonel went down. It was proof that Berdan's men could bleed just as badly as any other regiment when they were caught in the open by massed volleys rather than operating with the cover and distance that normally protected them. But a costly day of fighting was not the same thing as being neutralized as a fighting force, and the regiment was back in action within days, still operating exactly the same way it always had, still crawling forward to trade shots with officers and gunners rather than standing in a line. At Gettysburg the following July, in a stretch of woods near Pitzer's farm on Seminary Ridge, roughly 100 sharpshooters, reinforced by 200 Maine infantrymen, held off the advance guard of a full Confederate brigade for nearly 20 minutes, firing with such volume and accuracy that the Confederate commander reported facing 2 entire regiments rather than the small mixed force actually dug in among the trees in front of him. That kind of result, a handful of men making an entire brigade believe it faced an army twice its actual size, was not something any Confederate countermeasure fielded up to that point in the war had managed to prevent, even 3 full years into the conflict, and after every adjustment Confederate commanders had tried to make. What finally ended Berdan's sharpshooters was not a Confederate rifle, a Confederate battalion, or a Confederate general with a plan that finally worked after years of trying. It was paperwork. The men who had enlisted in the recruiting drives of 1861 signed on for 3 years, the standard term for volunteer regiments in that stage of the war, and those enlistments began expiring in the summer of 1864, right in the middle of the brutal Overland Campaign against Robert E. Lee in Virginia, a campaign that badly needed every experienced soldier it could keep in the field. The 1st Regiment mustered out that August, not because it had been broken in battle or driven from a field, but because its 3-year term of service had simply run its course, while the war around it ground on toward its final year. What remained of the regiment was folded into a temporary battalion that lasted only a few more months, and the men whose enlistments had not yet expired were absorbed into the 2nd Regiment by the end of the year, apart from a group of Michigan soldiers who were transferred instead to an infantry regiment from their home state. The 2nd Regiment itself was formally discontinued in February of 1865, its companies dispersed into other units scattered across the Army of the Potomac only weeks before the war ended at Appomattox Courthouse. The Confederacy that had tried ordinary muskets, imported Whitworth rifles, and dedicated sharpshooter battalions against these men for nearly 4 years never once managed to force them off a battlefield or break them as a fighting unit. It took the Union's own enlistment calendar not a single Confederate bullet to finally stand them down. The record left behind supports the reputation more than it undermines it, and it holds up under closer scrutiny far better than many wartime legends do. Across nearly 4 years of continuous service, from Yorktown through the Wilderness and the opening months of the Siege of Petersburg, the 2nd Regiment alone lost more than 100 enlisted men and several officers killed or mortally wounded in combat, casualties that came almost entirely from a unit that was, by design, never supposed to stand and slug it out in the open the way ordinary infantry did on a normal battlefield. It has often been claimed that Berdan's sharpshooters inflicted more casualties on the enemy relative to their own numbers than any other Union regiment of the entire war, a claim difficult to verify with total precision against every other unit's surviving records, but consistent with everything the documented history shows about how differently these men fought and how rarely the other side ever found a workable answer for them, despite every adjustment and every new weapon they brought to bear against the problem. Confederate soldiers who served through 4 years of trying to solve the problem Hiram Berdan had created in a New York recruiting office that first summer would have understood the title of this story without needing a single word of it explained to them, because they had lived with the consequences of that recruiting drive on nearly every battlefield of the war in the East. They tried standard muskets and volley fire. They tried imported precision rifles from across the Atlantic. They tried entire battalions organized for exactly this purpose and nothing else. None of it worked the way it needed to, no matter how much time or how many resources went into the attempt. In the end, the only thing that ever truly stopped Berdan's sharpshooters was time itself running out on their own enlistments. Not a single tactic or weapon the Confederacy ever managed to field against them in 4 years of trying. If you enjoyed this one, go ahead and hit subscribe for more stories like it.